The auction notice in the back of the Trenton Gazette listed the property for $1. Just that, $1. A single bill folded into the palm of your hand for a 1903 Stationmaster's house in a town nobody remembered, sitting on 3 acres of overgrown rail yard the county had been trying to unload for 14 years. Eleanor Whitcomb read that notice 3 times by the light of a flickering bulb in the back room of the Mercer County Library, because she had nowhere else to go and they let her stay until closing. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. She was 76 years old. She had a black coat that had belonged to her late husband, a paper sack of belongings, $11.43 in her wallet, and a knee that had been hurting since November. She had been sleeping in the library reading room on the days the weather turned, and on the bus when it didn't, and once for 2 nights in the lobby of a Methodist church that pretended not to see her. She read the notice a 4th time. $1. There had to be a catch. Of course there was a catch. There always was. The catch, when she walked to the county building the next morning, was that nobody had wanted the place for a reason. The stationmaster's house was condemned. The roof had partially collapsed during a storm in 2019. The well was bad. The signal room out back had been padlocked since the line stopped running freight in 1986, and the locks had rusted into the doors. The land was zoned for nothing useful. The county clerk, a tired woman named Marjorie with a coffee cup that said "World's Okayest AUNT," looked over her reading glasses at Eleanor for a long moment, and then said quietly, "Honey, this isn't a place for a woman your age. This is a place for a developer with a bulldozer." Eleanor placed a single dollar bill on the counter. It was wrinkled. She had ironed it that morning in the library bathroom with the hand dryer. "I'd like to buy it," she said. Marjorie stared at the dollar. She stared at Eleanor. Then she pulled a clipboard out of a drawer and said, "Sign here, here, and here. And God help you, ma'am." To understand how Eleanor ended up signing that clipboard at the age of 76, you have to understand the kind of life she'd had before, because nothing about her was the kind of person you'd expect to find sleeping in a public library. Eleanor had been a 3rd-grade teacher in Hopewell Township for 41 years. She'd married a man named Harold Whitcomb in 1971, a quiet machinist who built model trains in the basement and brought her tulips every Easter without fail. They had 1 daughter, Caroline, born late in life when Eleanor was 38, and the 3 of them had lived in a small yellow house on Linden Street that Harold paid off the year he retired. It was not a wealthy life, but it was a whole one. The kind of life where the freezer was always stocked with the casseroles Eleanor made every Sunday, where the porch light stayed on for whoever might be coming home. Then Harold died in 2019. A heart attack at the kitchen table while she was rinsing the breakfast plates. He just made a small sound, like he'd remembered something, and was gone before she got to him. Eleanor was 69. She mourned him properly, the way old-fashioned women still do, with black clothes and church on Sundays and casseroles brought to her now instead of the other way around. She thought she would live out her days in the yellow house. She thought wrong. Caroline came down from Boston 3 months after the funeral with her husband Derek, a man Eleanor had never warmed to but had tried, the way mothers try. Derek owned a string of failing fitness studios. He talked too loudly and laughed at his own jokes, and had the kind of handshake that crushed your fingers to prove a point. He had ideas, he said. Ideas for how Mom could leverage her assets, now that Dad was gone. The yellow house was worth something. The investments Harold had left, modest but real, were just sitting there. Caroline wouldn't quite meet Eleanor's eye while Derek talked. That was the first sign. Eleanor signed the papers anyway. Not because she didn't see what was happening, but because she did. Caroline was her only child. Caroline was struggling. Caroline had cried in the upstairs bathroom for an hour the night before, and Eleanor had stood outside the door listening. And she had decided then and there that if her daughter needed the house and the money to keep her marriage afloat, she would give it. That's what mothers did. That was what her own mother had done. That was what every woman in the Whitcomb line going back to the Dust Bowl had done. You gave. You believed. You hoped it would be enough. It was not enough. Derek's fitness studios collapsed within 18 months. The money was gone. The yellow house was sold to cover the debts. Caroline moved with Derek to a rental in Pennsylvania, and Eleanor went with them because there was nowhere else to go. The arrangement lasted for months. Derek picked the fight on a Tuesday morning. He said Eleanor used too much hot water in the shower. He said the smell of her cooking made him sick. He said she was a burden and that he hadn't signed up to take care of someone else's mother, and that Caroline needed to make a decision. Caroline made it. She drove Eleanor to a bus station in Trenton with a paper sack and $200 cash, and she said, "Mom, I just need some time. I'll call you when I can. Stay somewhere safe." Eleanor stood on the curb with her sack and watched her daughter's car drive away. She did not cry. There would be plenty of time for crying later, and she had things to figure out first. That was 11 months ago. 11 months of motels paid for one night at a time. 11 months of soup kitchens and the YMCA, and learning the rules of an existence she'd never imagined for herself. 11 months of writing Caroline 3 letters a week and never receiving a single reply. The $200 had become $11.43, and a knee that hurt in the cold. And then, on a Wednesday in late February, she'd opened the Gazette and seen the notice. $1. A stationmaster's house. A place to put a key in a door and call it hers, even if the roof was caving in. Marjorie at the county building handed her a brass ring with 3 keys on it, and a deed printed on watermarked paper, and a sympathetic look that Eleanor pretended not to see. "The road in is gravel," Marjorie said. "There's no plowing service. Power's been cut since '92. Well, water's not safe to drink. I'm telling you all this because nobody else will." Eleanor folded the deed carefully into her coat pocket. "Thank you, Marjorie. You've been very kind." Then she walked the 7 miles out to the property because she didn't have money for a cab, and her knee hurt the whole way, and she didn't care because for the first time in 11 months, she was walking towards something instead of away. The Whitcomb Crossing Stationmaster's house sat at the end of a gravel road that branched off Route 31, hidden by a stand of black walnut trees so overgrown that Eleanor walked past the turnoff twice before she found it. She came up the drive in the late afternoon, the February light thin and yellow on the bare branches, her breath puffing white in the cold. And then she saw it. The house was smaller than she'd imagined, and worse, and somehow also better. It was a 2-story clapboard structure painted a faded mustard yellow that had once been the standard color of the Pennsylvania Reading Railroad. The shingled roof sagged on the east side where the storm had gotten it. The porch was missing 2 of its posts and listed slightly to the left like a man with a bad hip. The windows were boarded over with plywood gone gray from weather, but the bones of it stood square and stubborn against the trees, and there was a brick chimney that looked sound, and at the gable end above the front door, almost too faded to read, were carved wooden letters that spelled out Whitcomb Crossing. Eleanor stopped in the gravel. She put her hand to her mouth. Whitcomb, her own name, Harold's name, carved into the gable of a house she had just bought without ever once knowing it existed. She stood there for a long time, the wind moving through the walnut trees, and she did not understand how a thing like that could happen. Coincidences did happen, of course. Whitcomb was not such an unusual name in central New Jersey. There had been Whitcombs in this county since before the Civil War. It could mean nothing. It probably meant nothing. But she stood there until the cold drove her toward the porch anyway, because some part of her, the part that had read 40 years of Sunday school lessons and believed in the small mercies, the part that had married Harold because he brought her tulips, that part was already saying something underneath her ribs that sounded a great deal like welcome home. The front door key turned. That alone was a small miracle, given how rusted everything else looked. The hinges complained, and the door dragged across a warped threshold, but it opened. Inside, the air smelled like cold paper and old varnish and something else, something faintly sweet, like the inside of a wooden cigar box. The light through the cracks in the plywood fell in long pale stripes across a hallway floor of wide plank pine. There was furniture. That was the first surprise. Not much, and what was there had been draped in old bedsheets gone yellow with dust, but the house had not been emptied the way she'd expected. A coat tree leaned in the corner. A grandfather clock stood against the wall, its pendulum still, its face frozen at 4:17. A staircase rose to the second floor with a banister whose carved newel post had been worked into the shape of a railroad lantern. Whoever had lived here had not been a casual occupant. Whoever had lived here had loved this house, and had left it the way you leave a room you intend to come back to. Eleanor walked through it slowly, room by room, because her knee was hurting and because she wanted to understand. The front parlor had a brick fireplace with a cast-iron damper and a mantel clock that matched the grandfather clock in the hall. The kitchen still had its original pine cabinets and a soapstone sink the size of a horse trough. A small back room had been a study. There were built-in bookshelves and a roll-top desk and, on the wall, a framed photograph she paused in front of for a long minute. It was a sepia print, slightly foxed. A man in a railroad uniform with a brass-buttoned coat and a stiff cap stood on the porch of this very house. A woman in a high-necked dress stood beside him, holding the hand of a small boy in knee pants. The man's mustache and the line of his jaw, even through the brown haze of a century, looked familiar in a way Eleanor could not quite place. She moved on. Upstairs, 2 bedrooms, one with an iron bedstead still made up under a quilt so dust-covered she could not see the pattern. A washstand with a ceramic pitcher. A child's wooden train pull toy, the paint chipped, sitting on a windowsill as if someone had set it down for a minute and never come back. Eleanor's eyes filled. She did not know why. She had not cried in 11 months. Not once. Not when Caroline drove away, and not in any motel, and not in any library. And now she was standing in a stranger's bedroom, touching a wooden train, and her face was wet. She wiped it with her sleeve and went back downstairs. She found the door to the cellar, but did not go down. The door to the cellar had its own lock, a thick iron padlock that the front door keys did not fit, and besides, her knee. There would be time for the cellar. She told herself there would be time. She had taken her coat off in the kitchen and was beginning to think practically about the night, about whether the chimney would draw, about whether there might be matches anywhere, when she heard the truck. A diesel engine, rough idle, coming up the gravel. Then the slam of a door. Then boots on the porch. Eleanor went very still. There had been moments in the past 11 months when she had been afraid, and she had learned to recognize the particular quality of the fear, the way it settled cold along her spine. A knock. 3 sharp raps. Hello? Anybody in there? A man's voice. Not unkind. Not exactly kind either. Eleanor smoothed her coat and went to the door. The man on the porch was in his 60s, weathered, in a Carhartt jacket and a wool cap. He had a face like a worn leather glove and pale gray eyes that took her in completely in about 2 seconds. Behind him, a red pickup with rust along the wheel wells idled in the drive. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his cap. "Saw the smoke, wasn't going up the chimney. Figured I'd check who was here. Earl Coddington. I've got the farm just down the road, other side of the creek." Eleanor Whitcomb. She did not extend a hand. She did not know yet whether to. "I bought the property this morning." Earl Coddington's eyebrows lifted very slightly. He looked past her into the house. He looked back at her. He took the cap off his head and held it in both hands. "Ma'am," he said, "you bought this place?" $1, Eleanor said, and she heard the small note of defiance in her own voice, and she did not apologize for it. "From the county." Earl was quiet for what felt like a long time. Then he said, "Well, I'll be." He looked at the gable over the door. He looked back at her. He cleared his throat. "Did Marjorie tell you about this house?" "She told me the roof was bad and the well was bad and that nobody had wanted it for 14 years. Did she tell you who built it?" "No." Earl turned the cap in his hands. "Maybe she didn't know. There's been 4 county clerks since the last person who remembered. This place was built in 1903 by a man named Cornelius Whitcomb. He was the stationmaster here for 31 years. He and his wife, Hannah, and their boy Thomas. The line ran freight through here all the way up to 86, but the passenger service stopped in the 40s, and after Cornelius died, the house just sat. His son inherited it, but never lived in it. His grandson tried to sell it in the 70s and couldn't, and after that it just..." He shrugged. "The county got it in a tax deal in 1996, and that was that." Eleanor held very still. "Cornelius Whitcomb." "Yes, ma'am. Do you know if he had any other family? Anywhere?" Earl looked at her again, more carefully this time. "Whitcomb is your name?" "It's my husband's name. He passed in 2019. He grew up in Trenton. He never spoke of any people up this way, but his father came from somewhere in this county, I always thought. Harold didn't talk much about his family." Earl nodded slowly. "Ma'am, you may want to sit down before you take one more step in this house. Because if your husband was a Whitcomb out of Central Jersey, there's a real good chance this place belonged to his people. And there's a real good chance you didn't just buy a house this morning. You bought your way back into something." He paused. "Now I don't mean to put a fright into you. I just mean, folks around here remember things. And there was always talk about the stationmaster's house, about what Cornelius left behind. What kind of talk? Earl Coddington put his cap back on. He looked at the boarded-up windows. He looked at the iron padlock on the cellar door visible behind her in the hall. He looked, finally, at the small brick outbuilding she had not yet investigated, a little 50 yards from the house, half hidden in the walnut trees, with a slate roof and a heavy door, and what Eleanor only now realized was a railroad signal post leaning beside it. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "talk about the signal room. Cornelius locked it the night before he died in 1947, and far as anybody in this county knows, no living person has been inside it since." Eleanor did not sleep that first night. She could not have, even if she'd had a bed prepared, even if her knee hadn't been throbbing, even if Earl Coddington hadn't gone back to his truck and come back with a kerosene lantern and a box of matches and 3 cans of beef stew and a thermos of coffee and a sleeping bag that he set down on her porch with the gruff matter-of-factness of a man who would not be argued with. "I'll come back in the morning," he had said. "If you need anything before then, my place is 3/4 of a mile down the road, white farmhouse with green shutters. Just walk it. You can't get lost." He had touched his cap again and looked at her one more time, and then said, almost reluctantly, "Cornelius was my great-grandfather's friend. They worked the line together. There's a picture of them in my dining room. I've heard about this house my whole life, ma'am, and I want to tell you something." "What?" Cornelius Whitcomb was a careful man. He didn't lock that signal room because he was hiding shame. He locked it because he was protecting something. That's what my granddaddy always said. He said Cornelius told him once that the worst storm of his life was coming, and he was going to put the most important thing he had where the storm couldn't get it. Earl had paused. "I never knew what that meant. Nobody did. The line stopped, and Cornelius died, and the keys went into the ground with him. Folks tried to get into that signal room over the years. The locks held. After a while, people just stopped trying." He looked at her, those pale gray eyes steady. "You're a Whitcomb. You bought the house legal. Anything in that signal room is yours by law, ma'am. And I think—" He stopped. He shook his head. "I don't know what I think. I'm an old man, and I've heard ghost stories my whole life. But you have a right to know what you walked into." Now it was past midnight. Eleanor sat in the front parlor of the stationmaster's house with the kerosene lantern hissing softly on the mantel, wrapped in Earl Coddington's sleeping bag, looking at the framed photograph of Cornelius Whitcomb in his brass-buttoned coat. The mustache, the line of the jaw, the set of the mouth. She knew now why it had looked familiar. It was Harold's face. It was her husband's face looking back at her from 1908 or thereabouts, on the porch of a house she had stumbled into by reading a $1 auction notice in a public library. Eleanor sat there a long time. Outside, the walnut trees moved against the wind, and somewhere a barred owl called once and then again. She thought about Caroline. She thought about the yellow house on Linden Street. She thought about the 11 months of motels and the bus stations and the librarian who had let her stay until closing. She thought about how a person's life could narrow down to $11.43, and then how it could, in the space of one day, in the space of one folded auction notice, begin to open back up. She did not know yet what was in the signal room. She did not know that the locks on that heavy door would resist her for 2 more days, or that what she found inside when they finally gave would not be money, not at first, but something stranger and more particular than money. She did not know that the brick padlock on the cellar door downstairs hid a second secret that would not surface for another week. She did not know that her daughter Caroline would, in 3 months' time, stand crying on this very porch in a way that would change everything between them, or that the man named Derek would face consequences he had not yet imagined. She did not know that the small brick outbuilding 50 yards from the house would turn out to have been built on top of something older. She knew only that she was sitting in a house her husband's grandfather had built, that her name was carved into the gable above the door, and that for the first time since Harold had made that small sound at the breakfast table and slid out of her life forever, she was not alone. She blew out the lantern. She lay down in the sleeping bag on the parlor floor. She closed her eyes. Outside, the owl called a 3rd time, and then the night went quiet, and Eleanor Whitcomb, age 76, formerly homeless, formerly forgotten, the legal owner of 3 acres of central New Jersey and 1 condemned stationmaster's house and 1 locked signal room, and whatever truth waited behind its iron-strapped door, slept for the first time in 11 months in a place that belonged to her. In the morning, the work would begin. Eleanor woke before dawn. The parlor floor had not been kind to her hip, and the cold had crept into the sleeping bag in the small hours, but she lay still for a long minute, listening. There was a quality to the quiet she had not heard in years. It was not the silence of a library after closing, or the held-breath silence of a motel room shared with strangers through thin walls. It was the silence of a place that was hers, and of a January morning settling over fields that had not been farmed in decades, and of a house that had been waiting. She pulled herself up using the arm of the wing chair beside the fireplace. Her knee complained. She told it to hush. There was work to do. She found a tin coffee pot in the kitchen and discovered, after some searching, that the soapstone sink had a hand pump rather than a faucet. She tried it. The handle creaked, then resisted, then with a deep sucking groan delivered a brown stream that smelled like iron and old stone. She let it run until it cleared. She did not drink it. Earl had warned her. But she washed her face, and the cold of that well water went straight through her, and she felt, briefly, awake in a way she had not been awake in a long time. By the time Earl Coddington's truck came rattling up the gravel at a few minutes past 7, Eleanor had taken inventory of every room on the first floor by daylight, and she had begun a list on the back of an envelope she'd found in the roll-top desk. The list said, in her schoolteacher's careful cursive, matches, candles, broom, gloves, drinking water, mousetraps, locksmith. She had underlined the last word twice. Earl brought breakfast in a paper bag. Sausage biscuits from a place called Helen's in town, still warm. A jug of well water from his own farm that he said was tested clean. A toolbox. A second sleeping bag. And his wife, a small spry woman in her 60s named Ruth, who introduced herself by handing Eleanor a thermos of hot tea and saying, "Earl told me a Whitcomb walked back into the stationmaster's house yesterday. I would not have believed him if I hadn't come to look myself." Ruth Coddington had silver hair cut short and the practical clear eyes of someone who had been a farm wife for 40 years and had no time for foolishness. She walked through the parlor and the kitchen and the back study without comment, the way a doctor walks through an examination, looking at everything and saying nothing until she'd seen it all. Then she came back to the kitchen and put her hand on Eleanor's arm. "You're going to need help," Ruth said, "and you're going to be too proud to ask. So I'm telling you now, we're going to help. Not because we feel sorry for you, because we don't. You've got more dignity in your little finger than most people have in their whole bodies. We're going to help because Cornelius Whitcomb pulled my husband's grandfather out of a snowdrift in 1923 and saved his life. We're going to help because that's what neighbors do, even when they're a generation late getting started. Are we clear?" Eleanor swallowed. She nodded. She did not trust her voice. "Good," Ruth said. "Now drink your tea before it gets cold. Earl's going to look at the chimney. I'm going to start on the kitchen, and then we're going to talk about what to do about that signal room." The work began that morning, and it did not stop. Earl ran a cable from a portable generator he'd brought in the bed of his truck. He got the chimney swept by reaching up with a length of chain wrapped in burlap and dragging 50 years of swallow nests and walnut leaves down onto a tarp on the parlor floor. He patched the worst of the roof on the east side with a blue plastic tarp lashed down with rope. "A temporary fix," he said, until the weather warmed enough to put proper shingles on. Ruth worked the kitchen. She pumped the sink dry of its rust and ran it again and again until the water came up gray and then clear. She wiped down the cabinets with vinegar from a spray bottle. She took the bed sheets off the furniture in the parlor and bundled them into a garbage bag to be burned. Underneath, the furniture turned out to be in remarkable condition. The wing chair was upholstered in a deep green velvet that had faded only along the arms. The settee against the wall was horsehair, stiff and ungiving, but its mahogany frame was unmarked. The mantel clock, when Ruth pulled it down and turned the key she found tucked inside its case, began to tick. It had not ticked since 1947. The sound of it filled the parlor, and Eleanor stood in the doorway with a dust rag in her hand and listened, and she felt something she had not felt since Harold died. The feeling of being inside a house that was alive again. By noon, 2 more trucks had come up the drive. A man named Pete from the volunteer fire company, who had been at Helen's when Earl picked up the biscuits and had heard about the Whitcomb woman and the stationmaster's house. A retired electrician named Walter, who had also been at Helen's, because in a town the size of Whitcomb Crossing everyone was at Helen's by 7:30, and word traveled the way it had always traveled. Pete brought a chainsaw and started in on the walnut saplings choking the drive. Walter walked through the house with a flashlight tracing the old wiring and shaking his head and saying things like, "Knob and tube, my lord, and you can't run anything off this. We'll need to bring in a new service entirely." But he said it the way a man says it when he has already decided to do the job and is just narrating his plan out loud. Nobody asked Eleanor for money. Nobody mentioned money. Nobody mentioned that she had $11.43 in her wallet and that her coat had a hole worn through one elbow. They simply worked. And Eleanor, who had spent 41 years standing at the front of a third-grade classroom watching small humans build small civilizations out of nothing, recognized what was happening, and she did not insult anyone by trying to refuse it. She thanked them. She made tea on a small camping stove Pete had set up on the porch. She wrote down each person's name in her notebook because she intended to repay every kindness, even if it took her the rest of her life. By 4 in the afternoon, the parlor had a fire in its hearth, and the chimney drew, and the smoke went up into the gray sky over Whitcomb Crossing the way smoke from this chimney had gone up for 44 years before Cornelius locked the door behind him and walked away. Eleanor sat in the green velvet chair with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea and watched the flames, and Ruth Coddington, in the chair across from her, said quietly, "Now, tell me about the signal room." The signal room would not give. That was the first thing they learned. Earl brought a heavy pair of bolt cutters from his truck and worked on the padlock on the heavy door for nearly 20 minutes, and the bolt cutters slipped twice and finally gave him a cut along the meat of his thumb that bled freely until Ruth wrapped it in a handkerchief. The padlock did not budge. It was iron and old, and rust had welded it into itself in a way that made it less a lock than a single solid lump of metal. The hinges of the door were on the inside, which Earl noted with a low whistle and the comment that whoever had built this door had not wanted anyone coming in through the hinges either. The door itself was 3 inches thick. "Hard oak," Earl said, running his hand over the grain, from a tree that had probably been standing when Washington crossed the Delaware. He looked at the padlock. He looked at the windowless walls of the brick outbuilding. He looked at the railroad signal post leaning beside it, a tall iron mast with a glass lens at its top that had once been red. "Eleanor," he said, "I don't think bolt cutters are going to do it. I don't think a crowbar is going to do it either. I think we're going to need a locksmith. A real one. Somebody who knows old iron. And I don't know if there's one of those still alive in Mercer County." Eleanor stood in the cold looking at the door. Her breath came out white. She thought about how long this door had been closed. She thought about Cornelius Whitcomb standing in this exact spot in the autumn of 1947, putting his key in. This padlock for the last time. She thought about what a man puts inside a room before he locks it and never goes back. "Then we find one in the next county," she said. "Or the one after that. We find one. This door opens." Earl nodded slowly. He was still pressing the handkerchief to his thumb. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "It does." They walked back to the house in the dusk. The walnut trees rattled against each other in the wind. The lights Walter had managed to rig in the parlor glowed yellow through the windows, and somebody had put a kerosene lantern in the front window, and the stationmaster's house at the end of a gravel road in a forgotten township looked, for the first time since 1947, like a place where someone lived. Eleanor stopped at the porch steps. She turned back and looked at the signal room outbuilding, a darker shape against the dark trees. She did not say what she was thinking. What she was thinking was that the door had felt warm under her hand when she touched it. Not actually warm. She knew that. February in central New Jersey, an iron-strapped door, no fire inside that brick room for 79 years. Of course it was not warm. But there had been something. Something underneath her palm that had pulsed once, the way a sleeping dog's flank pulses when you set your hand on it. She did not mention this to Earl. She did not mention it to Ruth. Some things you keep for yourself, at least until you understand them. It was the next afternoon when Caroline called. Eleanor had bought a prepaid flip phone at the gas station in town the previous summer, a small dignified vanity she had allowed herself in case the world ever needed to find her, and she had given the number to her daughter in 3 separate letters, none of which Caroline had answered. The phone rang while Eleanor was sweeping the upstairs landing. She nearly did not pick up. She did not recognize the area code. But some instinct in her hand answered it anyway, and her daughter's voice came through, thin and tight and oddly performative. Mom? Mom, where are you? Derek says someone called him from a county office in New Jersey about a property deed, and your name was on it. And Mom, what have you done? Eleanor sat down on the top step of the staircase. She set the broom against the banister. She looked down the staircase at the entry hall, at the grandfather clock that Ruth had started ticking yesterday, at the carved newel post shaped like a railroad lantern, at the brass keys hanging now on a small hook by the door. I bought a house, Caroline. You bought a house. With what money? Mom, you don't have any money. You sold the yellow house. The money's gone. Derek says if you've signed anything, if you've taken on a mortgage, we need to undo it before it ruins your credit, and then it'll be my problem because I'm your next of kin, and I paid $1, Caroline. A pause. What? The house cost $1. The county put it up at auction. I had the dollar. I bought it. I am living in it now. Mom. The performance dropped out of Caroline's voice, and something rawer came through, briefly. Mom, that's not a house. That's a teardown. That's a hazard, that's. Where even is it? Derek looked it up. He said it's some falling down railroad shack in the middle of nowhere. He said you're being scammed. That's someone setting you up. Mom, you can't live in something like that. You're 76. Come back to Pennsylvania. We'll figure something out. Will we? The words came out before Eleanor could stop them, and once they were out, she did not want to take them back. Will we figure something out, Caroline? The way we figured something out in November, when Derek told me the smell of my cooking made him sick. The way we figured something out in December, when you drove me to a bus station in Trenton. I haven't heard from you in 11 months. I wrote you 36 letters. I counted. Silence on the line. Then her daughter's voice, smaller. Mom, I love you, Caroline. I will love you until I am in the ground. But I am not coming back to Pennsylvania. I have a house. I have a fire in the hearth. I have neighbors who came over with biscuits this morning and patched my roof for nothing. I am not coming back. Eleanor's hand was shaking. She did not let it show in her voice. If you want to come see me, you are welcome. The address is Whitcomb Crossing Road, off Route 31. There is no number on the mailbox yet. I will put one up this week. But Caroline, you come alone. You do not bring Derek to this house. Do you understand me? A long pause. Then, yes, Mom. Goodbye, Caroline. I'm glad you called. She hung up before her daughter could say anything else, because she did not trust herself, and because her knee was hurting, and because she had not, in 11 months, said any of those things out loud to anyone, and saying them had taken something out of her that she needed to sit with privately. She sat on the top step for a long time. The grandfather clock in the hall ticked steadily. Somewhere outside, a crow called. Eleanor breathed in and out, the way she had taught her third graders to breathe in and out when they were upset. Slow in through the nose, slow out through the mouth, and after a while her hands stopped shaking. She picked up the broom. She finished sweeping the landing. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The first real clue came that evening, and it came from a place Eleanor had walked past 5 times without noticing. She had gone back into the small study off the kitchen, the one with the roll-top desk and the built-in bookshelves, and the framed photograph of Cornelius and Hannah and the boy Thomas on the porch. She had decided to clean the bookshelves. There were perhaps 80 volumes on them, some bound in leather, some in cloth, mostly 19th century texts on railroading and engineering and the natural history of New Jersey. They were dust-thick, but otherwise sound. Eleanor began at the top shelf and worked her way down, taking each book out, wiping it with a damp rag, setting it aside. She found, between the pages of a Bible on the third shelf, a pressed sprig of lavender that crumbled to nothing when she touched it. She found, inside the cover of a railroad almanac for the year 1919, a child's drawing in pencil of a steam locomotive with the words Thomas Whitcomb, age 7, written in a careful round hand at the bottom. She set this aside. She would frame it. On the bottom shelf, behind a row of bound issues of Railway Age, she found something different. A wooden box, about the size of a hat box, with a hinged lid and a small brass hasp. The hasp was not locked. Eleanor sat down on the floor of the study, her knee folded awkwardly under her, and she set the box in her lap. She opened it. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that had yellowed to the color of old teeth, was a stack of letters bound with a faded blue ribbon. Beneath them, a smaller velvet pouch. Beneath that, a folded piece of cardstock with handwriting on its outside that said, in a man's strong, slanted hand, "For whoever finds this, may the Lord guide you." Eleanor's hands began to shake again. She set the box down on the floor beside her. She picked up the folded cardstock first, because the letters and the velvet pouch felt like things that needed to be earned. She opened it. The handwriting was the same as the writing on the outside, and at the bottom of the page, the signature read Cornelius Bartholomew Whitcomb, in a hand that pressed hard enough to leave indents on the back of the paper. The note was dated October 11th, 1947. Eleanor read it once. Then she read it again. Then she put it down on the floor and pressed both her hands against her mouth for a long moment, because what she had read was this: "To whoever finds this, I am writing this on the eve of a journey from which I do not expect to return. I have been a stationmaster on this line for 31 years. I have been a husband to my Hannah for 36. I have been a father to my Thomas for 28, and a grandfather, though only in name, to a boy I have never been permitted to meet, and whose existence I learned of only through the kindness of a woman in Trenton who wrote to me last spring. My son Thomas is a hard man. He has not spoken to me in 19 years. The reasons are not important now. What is important is that he has a child of his own, a son, born in 1944. My grandson. The boy's name, I am told, is Harold." Eleanor stopped breathing. She picked up the cardstock again. She read the paragraph a third time. Harold. Her Harold. Her husband Harold, who had never known his grandparents, who had said his father had been an angry drinker, who had said the family had been broken for as long as anyone remembered, who had cried only once in their 48 years together, on the night his own father died estranged and unforgiven in a state hospital in 1989. Cornelius Whitcomb had known about Harold. Cornelius Whitcomb had known. Eleanor lowered the cardstock to her lap. She kept reading. "I have written to my son. The letters are returned. I have written to the woman in Trenton who told me of the boy. She is afraid of my son. She cannot help. I do not know if I will ever lay eyes on this grandson of mine. I am told my heart is not strong. The doctor in Lambertville has been clear. I will not put off this matter further. Therefore I have placed in the signal room of this property the inheritance that is rightfully my son's, and through him his son's. It is not money in the bank sense, though it has been valued. It is something more particular, and I have chosen to leave it in the form in which it lives because I believe my grandson, whoever he is, however he is raised, deserves to receive it as I received it. The signal room is locked. The key has been hidden in this house, where it will keep until a Whitcomb stands in this kitchen who has the wit to find it. The key I refer to is not the brass key on the ring. The brass key opens nothing of consequence. The key I refer to is iron. It is small. It is hidden behind the third brick from the bottom on the left side of the parlor fireplace. To remove the brick, push hard on its top edge. The mortar around it is false. May whoever finds this know that they are loved, even by a man they never met, who failed in many things but did not fail in this. Cornelius Bartholomew Whitcomb. This 11th day of October, 1947. Eleanor sat on the floor of the study with the letter in her hand for a long time. The kerosene lantern hissed in the corner. Outside, the February dark had come down. Somewhere a fox barked. She did not cry, because she had cried already that day, on the phone with her daughter, and the body has its limits. But she sat very still, and she let what she had read move through her. Harold, her husband, who had grown up in a small apartment in Trenton with a father who came home drunk on Fridays and a mother who left when he was 9, who had spent his whole life believing he came from nothing and nobody, who had built model trains in their basement on Linden Street for 40 years without ever once knowing that his own grandfather had been a stationmaster on a real one. Harold, who had brought her tulips every Easter. Harold, who had died at the kitchen table never knowing. Eleanor closed her eyes. She thought, Harold, you would not believe this. She thought, Harold, your grandfather knew you existed. He knew, and he loved you, and he tried to reach you, and he was kept from you. And then he put something in a locked room and waited for one of us to come and find it. The lantern hissed. The grandfather clock in the hall ticked. After a while, Eleanor pushed herself to her feet using the edge of the roll-top desk. Her knee protested. She told it to keep quiet. She picked up the lantern and she walked, slowly, deliberately, from the study to the parlor, where the fire was still burning low in the brick hearth. She set the lantern on the mantel. She knelt in front of the fireplace. The bricks were the original red clay brick, hand-fired, set in a herringbone pattern around the firebox. She counted from the bottom. 1, 2, 3. The third brick from the bottom on the left side. She placed her palm against its top edge. She pushed. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a small soft grinding sound, the brick shifted. The mortar around it crumbled into red dust. The brick tilted forward into her hand, and she pulled it free, and behind it, in a small hollow no larger than a coffee cup, sat a single iron key tied to a faded blue ribbon, identical to the ribbon that bound the letters in the wooden box. Eleanor knelt on the parlor floor with the key in her palm, and she looked at it for a long time. Then she put it carefully into the pocket of her dress, and she sat back on her heels, and she said out loud, to no one, to Harold, to Cornelius, to herself, "All right then." The cellar she had not yet investigated. The cellar with its own padlock that was not the signal room's padlock, and that the brass keys did not open. The cellar that had been waiting, like everything else in this house had been waiting. Eleanor took the lantern down from the mantel. She walked to the kitchen. She walked to the door of the cellar at the back of the kitchen, the heavy plank door with the iron padlock that had stopped her on the first day. She held the iron key up to the lantern. Then she set the key into the padlock. It turned on the first try. The padlock fell open into her hand. The cellar door swung inward on hinges that did not creak, because someone had oiled them, a long time ago, with care, before they left this room. And Eleanor Whitcomb, 76 years old, the granddaughter-in-law of a stationmaster she had never met, the wife of a man who had died without knowing his own name, raised her lantern and walked down a set of pine steps into a darkness that had been waiting for her for 79 years. The cellar steps were pine, and they were sound. That was the first thing Eleanor noticed, because she had braced herself for rot and a fall, and instead the boards took her weight the way boards take weight when they have been seasoned for 120 years and built by a man who meant them to last. She went down one slow step at a time, her left hand on the lantern, her right on the rail, her knee protesting at every transfer of weight. The light from the lantern moved in a small yellow circle around her. The smell coming up from below was dry and cool, with a faint trace of something mineral underneath it, the way an old root cellar smells when nobody has been in it for a long time, but the air has stayed sealed. At the bottom of the steps, she stopped. She lifted the lantern higher. The cellar was larger than she had expected, larger than the footprint of the house above. The walls were brick, the same red hand-fired brick as the fireplace. The floor was packed earth, swept smooth. The ceiling was the underside of the first floor, hand-hewn beams she could read the broad axe marks on, and between the beams ran iron strapping she did not understand at first. Then she did. Wires. Old telegraph wires. The cellar was wired into the railroad communications system that had run through this property a century ago. Cornelius Whitcomb had built his cellar to be a place where messages came through. Eleanor walked forward slowly. The lantern light moved over the room, and what it showed her made her stop and stand very still. Against the far wall stood a workbench, 12 feet long, of solid oak, and on the workbench, set out in careful rows, were tools. Hand tools. Woodworking tools. A wooden plane that gleamed with the soft sheen of beeswax, recently applied, which was not possible. A set of carving chisels lined up in order of size, their handles dark with the polish of a man's palm. A tri-square, a marking gauge, a brace and bit. A small wooden box of nails. A glue pot. Eleanor moved closer. The lantern light caught the workbench, and she saw, set into the wood near the corner, a brass plate that had been screwed there many decades ago. The plate had been polished. Recently. By whom? She could not say. The plate read, C. B. Whitcomb and Son, EST 1923. She put her hand over her mouth. Cornelius Whitcomb had been a stationmaster on a railroad. But Cornelius Whitcomb had also been, in the basement of this house, a carpenter, with his son Thomas, with Harold's father. The grandfather Harold had never known had spent his evenings down here at this workbench, teaching a young Thomas how to set a plane and red a grain. And Thomas, Harold's father, who had grown up to be the angry drunk Harold had buried in 1989, had once been a boy in this cellar learning to work wood with his father. And Harold, who had spent 40 years building model trains in their basement on Linden Street, who could look at a piece of walnut and see a music box inside it, who had never known where any of it came from. Eleanor sat down on the bottom step. She put the lantern on the floor beside her. She wept. Then, the way she had not let herself weep when Caroline drove away, the way she had not wept in the library or in any motel, deep and slow and without sound, her shoulders shaking under the black coat that had been Harold's. She wept for Harold, who had never seen this cellar. She wept for Thomas, who had walked away from his father and lost a whole inheritance for the sake of whatever pride had hardened in him. She wept for Cornelius, who had laid out these tools and polished this plate and gone upstairs and locked his signal room and lain down to die alone, hoping that someday someone of his blood would walk back down these stairs and understand. When she could see again, she stood up. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. She walked the length of the cellar slowly, lifting the lantern over each thing as she went. There was more than the workbench. There were 2 finished pieces. A small writing desk with a slant top, oak with walnut inlay, the kind of desk a child might use. Pulled up to it, a child-sized chair with a carved back. A jewelry box on the desk, perhaps 8 inches square, the lid carved with the figure of a hummingbird in flight. Eleanor stopped breathing. She knew the jewelry box Harold had carved for her in 1973. The hummingbird on its lid had been his own design, he said. His own. He had told her he had dreamed it. He had told her he had no idea where the image had come from. The hummingbird on the jewelry box on the small desk in front of her was the same hummingbird. Identical. The same wing set, the same angle of the body, the same small, careful eye. A boy in this cellar had watched his father carve a hummingbird onto a jewelry box for his mother in the 1930s, and that boy had grown into a man who had passed nothing on to his own son in words. But somehow, somewhere, in some hand-down of bone and memory, the image had survived, and Harold had picked up a chisel 40 years later and carved it again without knowing why. Eleanor pressed her palm against the carved hummingbird on the lid of the box. The wood was cool. The work was magnificent. The wood was Harold's wood, in the language of wood, in the way only people who have lived with a careful woodworker their whole lives can recognize. She thought, my husband's hands learned from this, even when they did not know, even when no one ever taught them. She walked the rest of the cellar in a daze. There were 2 more pieces. A rocking horse, mane carved, eyes painted, made for a grandchild who had never been allowed to ride it. A wall clock, casework finished, mechanism never installed, with a small handwritten note pinned to its back that said, in Cornelius's hand, for Harold, when he is a man. Eleanor sat down on the bottom step a second time. She held the lantern. She did not cry now. Something in her had moved past crying and into a place that was quieter. She thought, all right, the signal room next. She picked up the lantern. She climbed the cellar stairs, 1 careful step at a time, and she did not look back, because the cellar was not going anywhere, and what was in it would be there in the morning, and there was still the matter of the room behind the iron-strap door. The signal room opened on a Saturday morning, 3 days later, and it took a locksmith named Joaquin Reyes from Lambertville and a propane torch and 45 minutes of patient work to do it. Joaquin was in his 50s, soft-spoken, with a steady set of hands and the kind of professional quiet that made everyone around him quiet too. Earl had found him through a chain of phone calls that started at Helen's and ended with a recommendation from a man who restored antique safes in Princeton. Joaquin had come out on his Saturday morning for no charge, he said, because he had heard the story of the Stationmaster's house from Earl on the phone, and because, he added with a small private smile, he was a man who could not turn down a lock that had been waiting 79 years. The community had gathered. That was the only word for it. Earl and Ruth were there. Pete from the volunteer fire company had brought his wife Mona and their 2 grown sons. Walter the electrician had come. Marjorie from the county building was there, in jeans and a parka, because Ruth had called her on Friday and said you had a hand in this, and you should be here when it opens. The pastor of the small Methodist church in town, a young man named Reverend Ellis, had stopped by to bring a casserole and had stayed. The postmistress, a woman in her 70s named Vivian, who had known Cornelius's daughter-in-law in the 1950s and had stories to tell, was there. Helen herself had come from the diner, bringing coffee in a 5-gallon igloo cooler with a spigot and styrofoam cups. Eleanor stood on the gravel in front of the brick outbuilding. The February sun was thin and bright. The walnut trees rattled. 23 people, She counted later. 23 people stood with her on land she had owned for 6 days, waiting for a door to open. Joaquin worked the padlock with the torch. The iron glowed orange. He worked the cylinder with a long, thin pick while it was hot. He worked it again when it cooled. He had explained that you could not simply cut the lock, because the door's iron straps were riveted into the masonry, and any violence to the door would damage the masonry. And the masonry was 120 years old and would not survive being damaged. Patience, he said. This is a door that wants to be respected. So he respected it. And the door, eventually, respected him back. The padlock turned, almost shyly, on his 43rd try. Joaquin lifted it off the iron staple. He set it carefully on a clean towel he had laid on the ground. He looked at Eleanor. "Mrs. Whitcomb," he said, "would you like to open the door?" Eleanor stepped forward. She put her hand on the iron handle. She thought. "Harold." She pulled. The door swung outward on its hinges, which someone, a long time ago, had oiled too. And the air that came out of the signal room was cold and dry and smelled of old paper and brass and a sharp ghost of pipe tobacco, as though Cornelius had finished his last pipe in this room and the air had held it. The sunlight fell past Eleanor's shoulder into the room. And the room was small, perhaps 10 feet by 12, brick walls, slate floor, no windows. On the far wall stood a heavy wooden cabinet with brass-handled drawers, 24 of them, arranged in a grid. Above the cabinet, on the wall, hung a framed map of the Pennsylvania Reading Freight Line as it had run in 1923, hand-drawn, hand-tinted, the names of every crossing and every signal lettered in a clerk's careful hand. On a small oak table beside the cabinet stood a brass telegraph key on a wooden base and a glass-faced clock that had stopped at 4:17, the same time as the grandfather clock in the hall. On the floor in the center of the room sat a single object covered in a heavy canvas tarp. Eleanor walked into the signal room. She felt the cold of the slate floor through the soles of her shoes. She walked to the tarp. She knelt down beside it, her knee complaining one final time and then giving in. She pulled the tarp back. Underneath the tarp was a steamer trunk, oak with iron banding, perhaps 4 feet long and 3 feet deep. The trunk was not locked. Whoever had locked the room had not seen the need to lock what was inside it, because the room itself was the lock. Eleanor lifted the lid. Inside the trunk, layered in oiled canvas wrapping, were the things Cornelius Whitcomb had left behind. A leather-bound ledger, the railroad's accounting for the years 1916 through 1947, in Cornelius's hand, every page tidy. Behind the ledger, a portfolio of railroad bonds, 12 of them, issued by the Pennsylvania Railroad Company in denominations of $1,000 each, dated 1908. Behind the bonds, a velvet-lined wooden case containing a set of railroad watches. Eleanor counted them. 7. Hamilton, Waltham, Illinois, Elgin. Heavy gold-cased pieces with white enameled faces and railroad-grade movements. Behind the watch case, wrapped in oiled cloth, 3 smaller velvet pouches. Eleanor opened the first. Inside, 22 gold coins, double eagles, $20 pieces. She did not know the year. She would learn later that they were 1907 St. Gaudens, the high-relief variety, in condition that would make a numismatist weep. The second pouch held 40 silver dollars and a small stack of half-eagles. The third pouch held something different. A single object wrapped in tissue. Eleanor unwrapped it carefully. It was a brooch. Gold, set with a single oval emerald the size of a robin's egg, surrounded by small diamonds. On the back, engraved, the words for Hannah, on our wedding day, October 11th, 1911. C. B. W. Eleanor set the brooch down on her palm. The emerald caught the light from the open doorway. She looked at it for a long time. Then, at the very bottom of the trunk, beneath everything else, she found a leather folio. She lifted it out. She opened it. Inside, in Cornelius's strong slanted hand, was a single sheet of paper that read, "To my grandson Harold, or to the heir of my grandson Harold, into whose hands these things come at last. What you find here is the savings of a working man's life, kept aside not for myself, for I had enough, but for the family I lost, and for the family I hoped would come after them." The bonds were bought with the wages of 31 years on the line. The coins were saved $1 at a time. The watches were given to me by the men I worked with, and they are railroad watches of the kind a man earned, not bought. The brooch was for my Hannah, who is now 20 years gone before me as I write this. Take what you have found and use it as you see fit. Use it to live. Use it to give. Do not let it harden you. The things I have failed at in my life, I have failed at because I let pride harden me, and pride cost me my son, and through him my grandson, and through him perhaps you. Do not be like me in this. Be like the better self I tried to be in this room, where I am writing this now, with the lines still humming, and the sun coming through the open door, and my Hannah's brooch in my pocket. The wood in the cellar is for your hands. The money in this trunk is for your life. The house above is for your home. I love you, whoever you are. Cornelius. Eleanor sat on the slate floor of the signal room with the folio in her lap and the brooch in her palm, and 23 people watching her from the doorway. She did not get up for a long time. Earl Coddington took his cap off and held it in both hands and did not speak. Ruth Coddington stood with one hand pressed against her mouth. Behind them, the others were silent, because they were not fools, and they could see that what had just been opened was not only a trunk. The appraisal took 2 weeks. Thaddeus Crane, the attorney Eleanor had retained for the deed work, found her a specialist in Princeton, a man named Howard Linwood who handled estate authentications for the auction houses in New York. Howard came out to the property on a Thursday. He brought white cotton gloves and a jeweler's loupe and a portable scale. He spent 4 hours in the signal room with the trunk laid out on the oak table, and he spoke very little while he worked, except once, when he picked up one of the St. Gaudens double eagles and held it under his loupe for a long minute, after which he set it down very carefully and said, to no one in particular, "My God." When he was finished, he sat with Eleanor at the kitchen table, and he had a written estimate. The bonds, he said, were the simplest. Pennsylvania Railroad bonds from 1908, 12 at $1,000 face value each, with all coupons attached and unclipped, were worth, to the right collector or museum, between $40,000 and $60,000 as a set, given their condition and provenance. The watches were a private matter, because railroad watches in original condition with documented service on a known line had a small but devoted market, and the 7 watches together, properly auctioned, would bring perhaps $80,000. The silver dollars and half eagles were straightforward bullion plus modest numismatic premium, perhaps $15,000. The St. Gaudens double eagles, however. Howard Linwood folded his hands on the kitchen table. He looked at Eleanor over the rims of his glasses. "Mrs. Whitcomb," he said, "these coins are 1907 high reliefs. 22 of them. In a state of preservation I have not seen in 21 years of doing this work. They were placed in those velvet pouches the week they were minted, and they have not been touched since. Each of them, individually, will bring between $45,000 and $70,000 at auction. The set together, I would estimate, will realize between $1.1 and $1.4 million. Eleanor did not move. Ruth Coddington, who was sitting in the chair beside her, made a small sound. "And the brooch?" Eleanor asked. Her voice was steady. She did not know how. "The brooch I would not sell," Howard said gently. "But for insurance purposes, the emerald alone, given its color and size and the period setting, I would value at approximately $110,000. As a piece, with the engraved provenance, more." He paused. "Mrs. Whitcomb, the trunk, in total, conservative estimate, $1.3 million. Auction estimate, $1.6. The high coins could go higher. The market for high-relief St. Gaudens has only climbed." Eleanor sat at her kitchen table in the stationmaster's house her grandfather-in-law had built in 1903, and she folded her hands in her lap, and she said, "Thank you, Mr. Linwood." She did not say anything else for a while, because there was nothing to say, and because she had learned, in 11 months of being a woman the world had stopped looking at, that when you finally had something to hold, you did not need to shout about it. You held it. That was enough. Caroline came on a Tuesday in late April. The dogwoods were just starting along the fence line, and the walnut trees had put out their first soft green, and Earl had finished the new roof on the east side and was working on the porch posts. Eleanor had bought paint. The house was halfway from condemned to handsome, and the mailbox now had a number on it, and the brass plate above the front door had been cleaned so that Whitcomb Crossing shone in the afternoon sun. Eleanor was on the porch with a cup of tea when the rental car came up the drive. It was a small white sedan, and it pulled to a stop, and Caroline got out alone. Eleanor had told her alone. Caroline had listened. That was the first sign of something. Eleanor's daughter walked across the gravel slowly. She was thinner than the last time Eleanor had seen her. Her hair was different. She was wearing a coat Eleanor did not recognize, and a pair of practical flat shoes. She stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, and she did not come up. She looked up at her mother. Her face was the face of a woman who had been doing a great deal of thinking on a long drive. "Mom," Caroline said. "Hello, Caroline." A long silence. The walnut trees rattled. A cardinal called somewhere behind the barn. Caroline finally said, "He hit me. In January. I didn't tell you because I didn't tell anybody. And then in February I started reading about what to do, and I left him in March. I'm staying with a friend in Doylestown. I filed for divorce on the 4th. He's been served. Mom, I am so sorry." Eleanor did not move for a moment. Then she set her teacup down on the porch rail. She walked down the porch steps, slowly, one at a time, her knee not bothering her at all now. She crossed the gravel. She took her daughter in her arms. Caroline made the sound that her own mother had made in the upstairs bathroom on Linden Street 4 years ago, the sound of a woman who had been carrying something alone for too long. They stood in the gravel like that for a long time. Eleanor said nothing. She did not need to. She was 76 years old, and she had been forgiven, and she had forgiven, and the two things had happened at almost the same time, the way her own mother had told her once they often did. When Caroline could speak again, Eleanor took her up to the porch. She sat her down in the chair Earl had repaired. She brought her a cup of tea. She let her cry some more, and then she said, "I am going to tell you a story now, about your father's grandfather, and about what is in the room out behind the house, and about why I am not coming back to Pennsylvania, and about why you are welcome to stay here as long as you want to. And then we are going to make dinner. Ruth is bringing chicken and dumplings. Earl is bringing his cider. There are people I want you to meet. Is that all right?" Caroline nodded. She wiped her face. "Yes, Mom," she said. "Yes." Derek came to the house once. He came on a Saturday in May, uninvited, in a leased SUV with a bumper sticker for one of his old gyms still on the back glass. Eleanor was in the garden behind the house, working a row of tomato seedlings into the soil Ruth had helped her prepare. Earl was on the roof of the signal room outbuilding, replacing 2 slates that had cracked over the winter. Caroline was inside, on the phone with the lawyer her mother had helped her find. The lawyer was not Thaddeus, because Thaddeus did not handle family matters, but he had recommended her, and the recommendation had been good. Derek pulled up the drive too fast and braked too hard and got out of the SUV with his face already set. Eleanor stood up from the tomato row. She brushed the dirt from her hands. She was, she realized, not afraid. She had been afraid of this man for 4 years. She was not afraid of him now. He started talking before he was even fully out of the car. He talked about Caroline, about her unreasonable behavior, about the money he said she owed him, about the fact that Eleanor had no right to interfere in their marriage, about the property and the trust. She had heard from his lawyer that there was something significant on the property, and he was entitled to know because Caroline was his wife and California was a community property state, which California had nothing to do with this. But he was the kind of man who threw legal-sounding words into a sentence like rocks into a window. Eleanor let him talk. Earl had come down off the roof of the signal room. He was walking, unhurried, across the gravel toward them. Earl was holding a roofing hammer in his right hand, casually, the way a man holds a tool he was just using. Earl did not say anything. He simply stopped about 10 feet from Derek and stood there. Behind Earl, Pete from the volunteer fire company had come up the drive in his truck. Pete had been bringing lumber. Pete got out of his truck, and he stood beside Earl. Walter the electrician was on his way too. He had been working on the new service entrance to the house, and he had heard the SUV and the raised voice. Walter stopped beside Pete. None of them said a word. 3 men in canvas jackets and work boots, standing on a gravel drive in central New Jersey, watching a man in a quarter-zip pullover yell at a 76-year-old woman in a garden. Derek stopped talking. He looked at the men. He looked at Eleanor. Eleanor took her gardening gloves off, 1 finger at a time, the way she had once taken her gloves off in a 3rd-grade classroom when a particular child had needed her full attention. She walked, slowly, across the garden bed and through the gate of the small picket fence Earl had rebuilt last month. She came to a stop perhaps 6 feet from Derek. "Derek," she said. Her voice was calm. It was the voice she had used on bullies in the 3rd grade for 41 years. "I am going to say 2 things to you. The first is that Caroline has a lawyer, and you will be hearing from her, and you will conduct all further communication through that channel. The second is that you are standing on my land. I have not invited you to be here. I am asking you to leave." She paused. "If you do not leave now, my neighbors are going to ask you to leave. And after that, I will call the sheriff. And the sheriff is the brother-in-law of the woman behind me who runs the diner in town. Do you understand me?" Derek looked at her. His face had gone through several colors. He opened his mouth. He looked at Earl, who shifted his grip slightly on the hammer in a way that was not, technically, a threat. Derek closed his mouth. He got back into the SUV. He drove off down the drive too fast, and gravel sprayed, and he was gone. Earl walked over. Pete walked over. Walter walked over. Earl said, "Eleanor, are you all right?" Eleanor put her gardening gloves back on. "I'm fine, Earl. Thank you. Boys, would any of you like some iced tea? Ruth brought a pitcher this morning, and I think it's still cold." That was the last time Derek ever came to the Stationmaster's house. The divorce went through in the fall. Caroline did not get a great deal of money, because Derek did not have a great deal of money, but she got her peace, and her mother, and a small upstairs bedroom in a house in central New Jersey that was being painted, room by room, the color it had been in 1903. The transformation was slow, and it was not dramatic. That was the thing Eleanor came to understand about real changes. They do not happen in a single moment. They happen in 1,000 small ones. The St. Gaudens coins went to auction in New York in September. 21 of them. Eleanor kept one. She had it set into a small frame on the mantel in the parlor, beside the framed photograph of Cornelius and Hannah and Thomas, because she wanted at least one of her grandfather-in-law's coins to stay in the house where it had been hidden. The auction realized $1,290,000. The bonds and watches and silver, sold separately over the following months, brought another $130,000. The brooch Eleanor did not sell. She had it cleaned, and she wore it on Easter Sunday, on the lapel of a new black coat that did not have a hole in the elbow. She paid off Caroline's legal debts. She set aside a fund for a granddaughter she had not yet met but hoped to, someday. She paid Joaquin Reyes a proper fee for the lock work, and she paid Howard Linwood for the appraisal, and she paid Thaddeus Crane for the legal work, and after all of that there was still more money than Eleanor had imagined a person could have. She gave a great deal of it away. Reverend Ellis at the Methodist Church received a check that allowed the church to repair its bell tower and start a small food pantry for the township. Helen at the diner received a check that paid off her mortgage on the building, with a note attached that said, simply, "For the coffee." You will never know how much it meant. Marjorie at the county building received a quiet envelope at Christmas that contained enough to send her granddaughter to community college for 2 years. The Mercer County Library, the one with the back room and the flickering bulb where Eleanor had read the auction notice, received an anonymous donation large enough to fund a new wing, with a single condition attached to the gift, that the wing be named for a third-grade teacher named Edith Park, who had been Eleanor's own teacher in 1955, and who had told a small frightened girl that she had a fine mind and ought to use it. The signal room Eleanor kept exactly as it had been, with one addition. She had the trunk moved to the cellar, where Cornelius's workbench stood. She had the workbench restored. She had a small placard made for the brass plate that already read C. B. Whitcomb and Son, EST 1923. The placard read, "And Harold T. Whitcomb, in memoriam, 1944 to 2019. Who learned these hands without knowing?" Earl's grandson, a boy of 17 named Caleb, had begun coming over on Saturdays to learn woodworking from a book Eleanor had bought him. He used Cornelius's tools, with her permission, with her blessing. Caleb's first finished piece was a small wooden box with a hummingbird carved into the lid. He gave it to his grandmother. Ruth Coddington cried when she opened it. Caroline began teaching art at the small elementary school in town. She had a degree she had not used in 15 years. The principal had hired her in August. She was good at it. The children loved her. Caroline came home in the afternoons to the stationmaster's house and helped her mother with the garden, and she painted the upstairs bedrooms, slowly, one wall at a time, and she did not cry as often as she had in April, and when she did, her mother sat with her until she was finished. Eleanor turned 77 in October. The community gave her a party in the side yard of the stationmaster's house. 41 people came. Helen brought pies. Reverend Ellis brought his guitar. Earl and Ruth brought a quilt they had made together over the summer, sewn from old fabric scraps Ruth had collected from neighbors all across the township, with the center square of the railroad signal post pattern. Eleanor sat in the green velvet wing chair, which Earl had moved out onto the porch for the occasion, and she watched the people of Whitcomb Crossing eat and laugh on the grass of her grandfather-in-law's house. And she thought, Harold, you should see this. She thought it without sadness now. She thought it the way a woman thinks of someone she has loved for a long time and is going to see again, eventually, when her own time comes. She had been a widow. She had been homeless. She had been written off by her son-in-law and by a county clerk who had felt sorry for her and by a daughter who had been too frightened to call. She had been a woman with $11.43 in a public library on a winter afternoon, reading a small notice in the back of a newspaper. She had picked up that newspaper. She had walked to the county building. She had put a dollar bill on a counter. And here she was, with a daughter and a community and a house and an inheritance her husband had never known he had. None of it had been luck. That was the part Eleanor came to believe most strongly of all. The dollar had been luck. The signal room and the cellar and the steamer trunk had been luck. The St. Gaudens coins had been luck. But the rest of it, the porch and the people on it, and the warm fall afternoon and the cardinal calling from the walnut tree, none of that was luck. That was the slow accumulation of small decisions she had made when no one was watching. To keep her dignity in a bus station. To iron a $1 bill in a library bathroom. To say yes to Earl Coddington's sleeping bag. To say no to Derek. To open her door when her daughter finally came up the drive. To forgive. To let herself be loved. That night, after everyone had gone home, Eleanor sat on the porch alone. The stars were thick and bright over central New Jersey, the way Cornelius and Hannah must have seen them from this same porch 110 years ago. The grandfather clock in the hall ticked. The fire in the parlor had burned down to coals. Eleanor sat there for a long time. She thought about her husband's hands. She thought about a hummingbird that had survived 3 generations of silence. She thought about a man named Cornelius who had locked a room in 1947 and trusted, against all evidence, that a Whitcomb would come back someday and open it. He had been right. He had been so terribly, beautifully right. Eleanor went inside. She closed the door behind her. She turned out the lamp. She climbed the stairs to the bedroom that had once belonged to a stationmaster and his wife, and she lay down under a quilt made by women she had not known a year ago, and she slept the deep and ordinary sleep of a woman who was, finally, home. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.